Hey everyone, welcome to a week plus of typography. There's a lot to learn about type. It goes far beyond using a drop-down menu on your computer and picking a typeface, although that is what most people associate with typography. If you were a design major, you would take two semesters just about type. There is so much to learn. And so over the next week plus, Eric and I are going to give you some very basic information about typography, how to use it, how letters are structured, how to combine letters, how to combine typefaces, how to understanding letter forms and how letters and words are spaced, how to use it in design. And then in a few weeks, you will have an assignment in which you will have to pick typefaces for a poster project. I'm going to start this week with a very brief history of typography. If you understand how type was created, you'll have a greater appreciation for the meaning behind some typefaces and how to use them. What you see on this opening screen is a representation of how type was created in early Roman times, and there wasn't printing then, so type was created by scribes writing either in books or engraving in stone. And then flash forward, not to the present, because look at the age of this Apple computer. It's vintage and I love it. But now, of course, people are picking typefaces on computers, and designers are designing typefaces on computers. If you're a type nerd like Eric and me, and believe me, there are millions of type nerds in the world, you will understand this cartoon. We've got Helvetica here saying, "Go away, Ariel," and Ariel is saying, "But Helvetica, no, accept me." Helvetica was a typeface that was designed in 1957 by a Swiss type designer. It's considered, it is a modern sans serif font, meaning it doesn't have anything extending off the base of the letters and off the end points of the letters. You'll see some serifs in a minute. Helvetica is one of the most widely used typefaces in the world. And at one point, certainly it was the number one font in the world, although you might think that would be Times New Roman. Arial was designed in 1982, and it was designed by two typographers for the Monotype foundry. Now, one thing to know is that there are different companies that own the licenses to typefaces. And while you can find many typefaces for free online, the best fonts you will not be able to find free. Now, if they're on your computer, it means it came with Microsoft. But Microsoft paid for it. You didn't. You paid for Microsoft. So, while you can find a lot of free fonts online, many of the typefaces that you might want to use or that a designer would want to use, they have to pay for. So Arial was designed in 1982 to compete essentially with Helvetica, which was a more expensive font, but it was created to occupy the same spaces in a line as Helvetica. So in other words, it was designed almost to look the same, but not exactly the same. You can see how the tail of this A is different. And also Arial is you can see that Arial is a little bit smaller and more rounded, and Helvetica has this kind of extension off the A. Is one better than the other? I prefer the original Helvetica, but of course Arial is widely used because it's so widely available. So at the time these were created, Arial was a much less expensive font than Helvetica, but now you can buy them both for around $35. And fun fact, the most expensive typeface in the world is a typeface called Lexicon, and it costs $4,999. Why is it so expensive? Because it was designed to be used and legible in very small sizes. Type, now not typefaces as we know them, but type itself is around 2,500 years old. And writing was invented in Rome. The Romans developed all uppercase first. Lowercase came along about 1,000 years later. At this time, only the wealthy knew how to read. So type was for wealthy people. Type was created in two ways, really. Handwriting, using ink on paper or papyrus, or engraving, as in this tablet here, which has been engraved, at this stone tablet in which the type has been engraved. Now, what I love about this tablet is how, when you look, and you can find these tablets in museums, ancient artifacts, what I love is how the typeface itself looks very similar to typefaces that you see today. This is another example of a handwritten document, a handwritten type on a document in which a scribe would have used ink. And this writing is called calligraphy. And we have many fonts today, typefaces, that were built on calligraphy. This style of writing and many typefaces today are considered humanistic. A humanistic typeface is one that looks somewhat like handwriting, and it's accessible and legible and readable in theory for the masses, although the masses at this time could not read. To appreciate typography, you really need to understand printing, because until we had a printing press, we did not have typefaces as we know them today. The earliest printing press was developed in China, used as early as 750 AD. However, this press technology did not make it to the West. And in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented what we refer to as movable type. He is credited with the invention of the printing press, although other people were moving in that direction. Now, how did the letterpress printing work? Well, what Gutenberg did was he created forms in which molten lead would be poured and hardened. And he created forms for every single letter of the alphabet, as well as numbers, and blank pieces of lead, think leading, were created to put between the lines. Now, the thing about letterpress is that a page had to be built backwards. The reason the page had to be built backwards is because if you place the letters in a form left to right, forward reading, if you put a piece of paper on top of that inked form and then you turn that paper over, those letters are going to be backwards. You can sort of simulate this as if you wrote on a piece of paper in some very wet ink and then pressed a piece of paper on top of it and turned it over. Or perhaps you can just visualize how that type would be backwards instead of forward reading. So this was one of the things that made printing a skilled craft, because you can imagine what it took to be able to build something backwards, to visualize it forward reading as you're building it backwards, and also to build a page one letter at a time. This is a type box, and you can see these compartments. In each one of these compartments, you would have a letter form. So they're long like this because the letter is actually at the top, or the image, the letter, the period, the punctuation is at the top of this little form. And then when it's dropped into the form, it would be at this depth. So you can imagine just how heavy a page of type was. Here's another example of a person building a letterpress page backwards, one letter at a time. This looks like a modern person, and it is a modern person because letterpress is still considered a craft technology, and letterpresses still exist today. Often they're used for invitations. It's an expensive printing form if you want to use this kind of printing. And you can even take a class in letterpress at KU, in which you will learn how to do this. And you can see him holding some letters in his hand that he's going to place in the form. In Gutenberg's day, that form would be wooden, and those letters would be laid. The form would be laid, and the letters would be laid in here. The type would be inked, and then this impression cylinder would be pressed on top of the paper, and voila, you have one page. So now consider just how long it took to print a multiple page document and multiple copies of that multiple page document. And yet printers got very good at this. And this was a form of printing, not this kind of press, but different presses. This is a kind of printing that was used well into the 20th century. The first typeface that was used in letterpress printing was black letter. Black letter is, as you'll see, it looks medieval. And it's because, in fact, black letter is medieval. It was created or designed in the 1200s. And this font, you can see that it looks inked. This is not a humanistic font. It's very angular. It's would not be considered as legible as a humanist font. Gutenberg used black letter in his very first document, which was the Bible. And perhaps you've heard of the Gutenberg Bible. There are still copies available in museums around the world. This would be hand painted. There was not a way to print this, so this would be hand painted on the page after the page was printed. The very first typeface that looks like typefaces that we know was a typeface called Jensen. Now, this version you're seeing here is an updated version of Jensen owned by Adobe. So if you wanted this version of Jensen, you would buy it from Adobe. Jensen was designed by someone named Nicholas Jensen. He worked with Gutenberg. He was French, and this is still considered the epitome of beautifully designed fonts. As you can see, Adobe has a version of it. Many designers design books especially. This is a beautiful book font in Jensen type. But what I want you to principally understand in understanding history and understanding printing and understanding the first typeface is that type design is a craft and an art. Letters do not just magically appear on a screen, but someone actually draws them on a computer, or formerly they would draw them on paper before the letters were created in lead. And when a type designer creates letters, they're not just creating one version, they're typically creating multiple versions of that font. So as a result, you have Helvetica, Helvetica Narrow, Helvetica Compressed, Helvetica Bold, Helvetica Italic. Every single version of a font has to be individually created and drawn by a designer, by a typographer, and also punctuation. And punctuation can even vary from typeface to typeface if you examine it. I just referred to the term font. A font technically is one version of a typeface, of a type. So a font, it could be italic times Roman. That is the font. But we use the word font generally to describe just what typefaces are. We say, what font is that? We say it's Times New Roman. So it's a term that's kind of used interchangeably for a particular typeface, but technically a font would be, in this case, the bold, and in this case, the regular version of Rockwell. So the font or the type that I am using in this lecture is Rockwell. Type belongs to families. So Rockwell is a family of fonts. Helvetica is a family of fonts. In that family are all the different versions of that typeface. And each one of those versions is a font. So we've got Rockwell families, Times New, it's just like the family, it's just like your family name. And there are many different versions of you in your family, or many different versions in your family name, and it's the same with type. I'm going to just give you a brief history of 4 typefaces. Every single typeface had a designer. Every single typeface has its own history. And if you Google any typeface, you can find a Wikipedia entry on it. So you can find out who the designer was, when it was designed, why it was designed. I'm going to take you through 4 just to give you an appreciation of how these typefaces were designed, and you can understand that all typefaces have their own story. The 4 I'm going to talk about are Dido, which was designed in the 1790s, Gill Sans, which was designed in 1928, Times New Roman, which was designed in 1929, and Comic Sans, which was designed in 1995. Now, the way I have these ordered is this is a serif, this is a sans serif, this is a serif, and this is a decorative font. When you read your book, and you will read your book because the type section is essential for you to review so that you can use type effectively. This typeface would be considered a modern serif. This would be considered a sans serif, hence the word sans. This would be considered a classic serif, and as I said, this is a decorative. What makes a modern serif or any serif different from a sans serif? It's the presence of serifs. You see, I'm circling a serif here, and I'm circling serifs here. These are 2 different kinds of serifs. This serif is considered a hairline. You see how it goes straight? This is a bracketed serif because it has this tiny little bracket in the serif. The bracket makes this a classic serif font. The hairline is what makes this a modern serif. There's another category of type, the slab serif, and Rockwell happens to be a slab. As you can see, the serif itself is very squared and slabby and blocky, and it's roughly the same width as the letter. So these, what you see right on this page, reflects the categories of fonts that you will learn about. let's talk about Dido. Dido is it's probably available to you through Microsoft, and it is widely used and it is widely misused. And the reason Dido is misused is because of the nature of the letters makes it unsuitable for small sizes. I'll show you an example in a second. Dido, though, was designed by a French printing and type producing family by the name of Dido. And here you can see an example of Dido in this block of text. Notice the very pronounced thick and thin of the letter. Also notice how vertical this letter is. These letters are, and that is another characteristic of modern serifs. Dido is the typeface that's been used as Vogue's logo for almost all of Vogue's history. Vogue began publishing around 1930. Magazines, by the way, their logos are their marks, sort of like they're trademarks, right? And they are rarely changed throughout the history of a publication. This, if you're being alert, is a sans serif. Oh, and I have a date right here in my notes if I would reference them. Vogue has used a modified version of Dido as its logo since 1947. Gill Sans. Gill Sans was designed in 1926 by this designer, Eric Gill. He was an artist, he was a sculptor, and he was a printmaker. He was kind of a hippie for his time. He lived in a commune with other artists. Here he is at 26. So, I mean, he totally, he looks like today's hipster. He was hipster back in the day, and only a few years older than you. Although he was quite a bit older than you when he designed his typeface, roughly 20 years later. There was a bookshop owner in Bristol, England, and this bookshop owner wanted a typeface for his sign. And so at first Eric Gill created a typeface just for his sign. But then he created an entire family of fonts around Gill Sans. And if you've ever been to London and been in the London Underground subway, you'll see that the typeface of Gill Sans looks very similar to the London Underground type. And in fact, that type is called London Underground, and it was designed to be competitive with Gill Sans. So when I look at Gill Sans, I do think of London, and I think of something that's vintage. But it's also a typeface that is very commonly used today. You'll see it in a lot of advertising. And part of the reason is that as a sans serif, it is humanist. And you can see right here it says Humanist Sans. Remember, a humanist font is one that feels like it's based on handwriting, and it tends to be warmer and more accessible than fonts that are not humanist. I think a lot of people tend to think of all sans serifs as being not humanist, but it's not true. Gill Sans is a humanist font, which is why I believe it's used so often in advertising. And you can see it down here. It's also legible in smaller sizes, and not all sans serifs are legible in small sizes. There's no better way to really understand what type looks like and how type reads and how readable it is. There's no better way to do that than to compare two blocks of text. Eric is going to talk about legibility versus readability. But when we think about readability of a font, what we're thinking about is how well you can read it in a block of text. Here I've compared two blocks of text, Gill Sans with Helvetica. You can see that the softer, more rounded version of Helvetica is easier on the eye than the much more angular and even version of Helvetica. So Gill Sans looks friendlier than Helvetica does. Helvetica tends to be more robustly, I suppose, modern. You can also see that these occupy different spaces. Both of these type sizes, I set this type myself, both of these typefaces are set in 14-point type. But you can see that Helvetica, the letter forms are bigger, and even though it's still 14, the letters use more space in a line, and because of that, you can't get the same number of letters in the same space as you can Gill Sans. So take a moment to look at that. And now, Times New Roman. Times New Roman was designed by Stanley Morrison for the Times of London newspaper. He designed it in 1929. The Times of London newspaper commissioned Morrison to design a typeface that would be easy to read, so readable in small sizes. And newspapers of that era tended to use type that was much smaller than newspapers today. How did he do that? How did he create a more readable font? He did it by making the weight of the strokes of the letter even. There is some difference in the thick and the thin, but you can see for the most part, if you look at these M's, that the weight of the letters is very even. We refer to that kind of evenness or unevenness, the way type looks in blocks of text, we refer to that as a type's color. So you can see that Times New Roman has an even color. Compare that to Dido, and remember I talked about the difference between the thick and the thin of the letters. Dido has a more uneven color. That uneven color is harder on the eye than even color. Which you might ask, well then why would we use Dido? Well, you use Dido for bigger type. So if you were designing a resume and you thought, I feel like Dido, I'm that modern but still classic person. So you would use Dido, you would set your name in Dido. But for the text of your resume, you would not want to use Dido because when printed in a smaller size, even than 14, on a resume, you might use 10 or 11-point type. This would be very hard to read. But you could use Times New Roman in the body text because these are very different looking fonts. You can combine them. So you might use this on your resume, the text, the smaller text of your resume, and Dido for the headings. And last, but certainly not least, Comic Sans. Why have I picked Comic Sans? Of all things, some of you may be saying right now, oh, Comic Sans, I hate Comic Sans. But why do you hate it? I ask you. Is it just because other people hate it? And who are those haters? So Comic Sans, a person, and you might be hurting his feelings. No, you're not hurting his feelings because he is so over this. but a typographer actually designed Comic Sans. And guess what he designed it for? He designed it for comics and children's books. His name is Vincent Canary. And Vincent Canary was hired by Microsoft in 1995 to design this font. It was supposed to be an accessible font, and appropriate for, as I said, appropriate, very appropriate for comics, and also as a font to be read by children. Here's an interesting fact. Canary was interviewed some years ago, and I don't know, forgive me, I don't know how long ago this was, so I can't date this, but the main designer at Twitter tweeted that the most server space is used, I'm going to guess this isn't true right now, but the most server space at that time was used to complain about airlines first, and second, to complain about Comic Sans. Third, okay, Justin Bieber. So this was a while ago. But Comic Sans is still the butt of so many jokes, and people started a movement to ban Comic Sans. Of all things, you're going to ban a perfectly functional font that's used for comics. I think a lot of the people who revile Comic Sans really don't know much about type. As you can see in this sweet little poster, this font accounts for the vast majority of punchlines and designer jokes, which only goes to show designer jokes suck. However, Comic Sans has gotten its reputation partly from weird usages like this banner on the largest theater in Valencia, Spain. Does this look appropriate? And it's been used quite a bit on museums, which is very funny, but it's actually Comic Sans is a very readable font. I mean, talk about a humanist font that looks like handwriting. Comic Sans is it. And for this reason, because it looks so humanist and because the letter forms are all slightly different and look a lot like handwriting, for this reason, this font is the most legible font and readable font for people who have dyslexia. Dyslexics have trouble with the even letter forms of many typefaces, but this font is one they can read, and it's might be many teachers use Comic Sans in their emails, and perhaps that's the reason, or perhaps they're just trying to make their emails feel a little friendlier. I'm going to end. Oh, well, no, I'm not ending yet. Sorry. We have this joke. Please keep the door closed, thank you, in Comic Sans, and then saying, please don't use Comic Sans. We are a Fortune 500 company, not a lemonade stand. That sign has a point. Maybe not appropriate, but perfectly appropriate for a lemonade stand. Now I'm going to end. Canary, he's a typographer, remember? Comic Sans is not the favorite font he's designed. His favorite font that he's created is this font called Magpie, which is a kind of quirky, classic serif. Serif, see the serifs there? It's a quirky, classic serif font that I can picture in an English pub or Beatrix Potter books. Okay, that's all on type history. It's a very, very brief review of type history. There's much more you can find out online, and I encourage you to explore.